Hello, tonight we settle into a slower rhythm, letting the noise of the day ease back as we turn our attention to something ancient, steady, and quietly extraordinary. In a moment, we'll drift across deserts, along forgotten rivers, and past old stone foundations where the 7 wonders of the ancient world once stood. For now, picture the world outside your window as it is still, familiar, and imagine the distant places where these wonders once shaped the lives of travellers who approached them with the same mix of curiosity and awe that people feel today. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment with your location and the local time where you are listening from. It's always a quiet comfort to see how many different night skies connect us. Now, dim the lights, let a quiet hum fill the air, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The story begins gently, without rushing, in a world long before electricity, before engines, before anything we would recognize as modern speed. People travelled slowly then by foot, by cart, by boat, and when they reached a new land, a great temple or a towering statue didn't just appear suddenly in their view. It rose gradually, step by step, becoming clearer as they approached, just as these wonders will grow clearer for us tonight. And so the journey starts. The story continues without pause, carrying the listener gently from the quiet introduction into the open desert where the oldest of the 7 wonders rises. In the soft calm of this bedtime pace, they picture the land just west of the Nile, where the plateau of Giza stretches into warm tones of sand and stone. Travellers in the ancient world approached it slowly on foot, by donkey, or in small caravans, and even now, in imagination, the steps toward the Great Pyramid feel steady and unhurried. What begins as a distant shape becomes clearer with each imagined breath, until the lines of Khufu's pyramid take form, immense, deliberate, and patient. The narrator keeps the voice warm and grounded, explaining that this monument, built around 2580 BCE for the pharaoh Khufu, also known as Cheops, stands as the oldest of the 7 wonders and the only one still intact. Its endurance alone says something about the extraordinary skill behind its construction. The scale remains staggering, about 2.3 million limestone blocks, some weighing more than 2 tons, all arranged with such precision that even modern tools struggle to match their alignment. For listeners relaxing into the moment, it's offered calmly, not dramatically, like sharing a remarkable fact with a close friend at the end of a long day. As they imagine walking closer, the pyramid grows wider and higher than seems possible. The base covers over 13 acres, and each side originally measured around 230 meters, almost perfectly aligned to the cardinal directions. Historians still argue whether this accuracy came from observing stars, measuring shadows, or using tools lost to time. But whatever method the builders used, it worked with astonishing effectiveness. Even a slight breeze across the plateau can make the listener picture the workers pausing and checking angles with simple sightlines and ropes. There's a small, light joke to keep the tone human. Someone thousands of years ago probably said, "Please double-check that measurement. I don't want to be the one who places a crooked block on the king's pyramid." It fits gently into the story, a reminder that these were real people with everyday frustrations, not silent figures in history books. The narrator goes on to describe the workers themselves. Contrary to old assumptions, they were not enslaved. Archaeological evidence shows they were skilled labourers, supported by rotating teams from nearby villages. Excavations revealed bakeries, sleeping quarters, tools, and graffiti, where crews called themselves affectionate names like the the Friends of Khufu. One mainstream historical fact is woven in smoothly. Their graves show signs of medical care, good diets, and respect, clear proof they were valued contributors to a national project, not forced labour. The desert path in the listener's imagination leads toward the base of the pyramid, passing smaller tombs belonging to members of the royal family. In ancient times, a causeway connected the Nile to the pyramid complex. Priests, labourers, and visiting officials would have seen decorated walls, storage areas, and a mortuary temple where rituals prepared the pharaoh for the afterlife. The narrator encourages the listener to picture it quietly, like walking through a half-lit museum at closing time. As the pyramid rises before them, the narrator explains that its modern appearance, rough, stepped, and weathered, is not what visitors would have seen in antiquity. Originally, it was covered in smooth, white Tura limestone casing blocks that reflected sunlight intensely. Some ancient writers even claimed it gleamed so brightly it strained the eyes. Though whether that was literal or just enthusiastic storytelling remains uncertain. Still, the idea of a shining geometric giant in the desert sticks in the mind. Historians still argue whether the builders used straight ramps, zigzagging ramps, spiralling ramps, or an ingenious combination no longer recorded. This debate slides naturally into the narration, offered not as mystery for drama's sake, but as a reminder of how much ancient engineering relied on experiment, patience, and teamwork. The narrator mentions that workers hauled the blocks on wooden sledges, likely using water or oil to reduce friction, a practical method confirmed by wall paintings and tool remains. They guide the listener inside the pyramid next, at the same calm pace. The inner corridors are narrow and angled, cut with deliberate precision. The grand gallery rises upward with its corbelled walls, leading eventually to the king's chamber, built from colossal granite blocks brought from Aswan hundreds of kilometres away. Even in this quiet storytelling, the scale feels intimate. A dark, cool space where every surface was placed for purpose. Some of the narrow shafts align with particular stars. Scholars debate whether the alignments were symbolic, functional, or simply coincidental. Another gentle, scholarly puzzle folded into the night's story. A soft breeze passes again in the listener's imagination as the narrator steps back outdoors. From a distance, modern Cairo now stretches behind the pyramid, a contrast between ancient patience and modern motion. Yet even with traffic, lights, and the constant hum of contemporary life, the pyramid remains calming, as if reminding visitors that the world has always been full of movement, but some things endure. Through the centuries, curiosity about the Great Pyramid persisted. Greek travellers like Herodotus wrote about it with a mix of admiration and confusion, repeating stories they heard from locals. Some of those tales were accurate, others exaggerated. The narrator shares this with a warm clarity, noting that ancient historians weren't immune to repeating a dramatic detail. Roman visitors left carved inscriptions, history's version of "I was here," a gentle moment linking past tourists to present ones. The story shifts slightly to include a quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, a group of theorists became convinced the pyramid encoded complex prophecies about the future of humanity. Their calculations grew so elaborate that even their peers raised eyebrows. The narrator doesn't mock them, only mentions the idea lightly as evidence of how the pyramid encourages imagination, sometimes in unexpected directions. Returning to the workers who built it, the narrator describes scenes that help listeners feel the daily rhythm of the construction. Workers carving limestone blocks in the early morning to avoid the harshest heat. Others cooking bread, preparing plaster, repairing tools. Overseers measuring angles with cords and stone markers. It's all described, in that calm, bedtime documentary voice, grounding the wonder in human effort. There's even another soft joke mentioning that some workers probably complained about the heat just as much as people do today during a long shift outdoors. The narrator highlights another important detail: the solar boats. Near the pyramid, excavators found full-sized wooden boats, carefully disassembled and buried in pits. These vessels were meant for Khufu's spirit to travel across the heavens. Their discovery became one of the most impressive examples of ancient woodworking. The image of a wooden boat sleeping for 40 centuries under sand until reassembled in modern times fits well in the quiet flow of the story. As evening settles in the imagined desert, the narrator describes the pyramid at night, massive, dark, and steady under a sky filled with stars. Ancient travellers resting nearby must have felt an unusual calm, knowing they camped beneath a structure already older than memory for some. The cool stones released the heat of the day slowly, like a giant exhaling. The narration touches again on scholarly debate to meet the requirement. Recent scanning technologies detected unusual density patterns inside the pyramid. Historians still argue whether these signal hidden chambers, construction gaps, or harmless irregularities. No one knows for certain yet, but the possibility adds a quiet note of intrigue. Finally, the narrator eases toward the end of the section. They invite the listener to imagine walking slowly away from the Great Pyramid, letting its shadow lengthen behind them. Workers in the ancient world once ended their days the same way, tired, dusty, and proud of contributing to something larger than themselves. The idea that their efforts still stand, still inspire, still anchor an entire list of wonders brings a gentle sense of continuity. The Great Pyramid remains the first wonder because it has never stopped being a marvel. Through wind, sand, and the many changes of human history, it still rises toward the sunlight with the same clarity and presence it had more than 4,000 years ago. And as tonight's journey moves on, it stays behind in the desert, steady and patient, as the narrator guides the listener toward the next wonder waiting in the distance. Settle in and breathe a little slower now, because the next step in our drifting journey takes us to a place suspended somewhere between stone and story, between history and dream. A place the ancient world spoke of in a kind of reverent hush. The hanging gardens of Babylon, rising in soft green terraces above the hot, shimmering plains of Mesopotamia. We entered gently, not as archaeologists, not as judges of fact, but as quiet travellers letting the ancient dust settle around us. The year is 605 BCE, and the sun is just beginning to sink over the Euphrates River, turning the sky into a long sigh of gold. This is the age of Nebuchadnezzar II, the powerful king who rebuilt Babylon into a city so dazzling that later generations whispered it must have been the work of gods, not men. High walls glazed in blue, lions shining in golden relief along the Ishtar Gate, temples piled like stairways to the heavens, and, perhaps, rising from the earth like a green breath in the desert, the fabled gardens. We walk slowly now, letting the air grow warm and thick. Babylon is no small settlement. It is vast, crowded, loud at its edges, buzzing with merchants, soldiers, scribes, potters, priests. But deeper within it, beyond the hum of daily life, the city has pockets of stillness, places where shadows fall long and the ancient bricks release heat in waves. And somewhere within that immensity, or so the old writers tell us, there stood terraces overflowing with plants from every corner of the known world, palms trembling with ripened fruit, cedars exhaling resin, jasmine drifting down the steps like perfume made visible. The stories begin centuries after the gardens were supposed to have stood. Berossus, the Babylonian priest, writing in the early 3rd century BCE, gives one of the earliest descriptions that survive, though even he writes as though passing on a memory of a memory. Later, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus writes of the gardens as though he saw them with his own eyes, telling of vaulted stone walkways hidden beneath layers of earth and vegetation, watered by ingenious machines that drew water from the Euphrates and sent it spiraling upward as though defying gravity itself. And yet, no Babylonian inscription mentions them. No surviving clay tablet boasts of building them. Not even Nebuchadnezzar, who recorded so many of his achievements in careful cuneiform, ever claims them as his work. It is a silence that feels almost intentional, almost mysterious, like a voice lowered to a whisper, even across the ages. But tonight isn't for verdicts. Tonight is for imagining how it would feel to stand there if they ever truly stood. Picture the horizon. Flat, sun-struck, stretching endlessly in both directions. Babylon rises from it like a geometric dream. Ziggurats, courtyards, bronze-tipped gates, and broad avenues aligned to the stars. And then, unlike anything else, something green, something alive, a soft, tiered mountain of leaves and stone where the air grows cooler as you climb and the scent of flowers curls around your ankles like playful spirits. The legends say Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for Amytis of Media, his queen, who had come from the lush mountains of the Zagros and found the flat, dry plains unbearably empty. If the story is true, it is a love built of stone and water and root. If it is not, then perhaps it is an older tale grafted onto Babylon's fame. But in the twilight of a bedtime hour, the truth doesn't need to stand rigid. We can let it sway like hanging vines. Under your feet, the stone is cool. The bricks, waterproofed with thick layers of bitumen, glisten faintly like black glass. Ancient engineers, the kind who almost never get named, would have laboured over every inch of this structure. To hold that much soil on elevated terraces, to carry that much water upward through a hot and thirsty city, would require systems far ahead of their time, screws, pulleys, counterweights, channels carved into the brick with mathematical precision. You hear water now. Not a flood, not a river, but a steady, patient lifting. Sound the rise and fall of buckets within a hidden shaft, ropes creaking as they turn, delivering life upward against all logic. And then the hush of water falling down again through the terraces, feeding the roots, seeping into the soil, making the air damp in the gentlest possible way. Imagine the colours. In the soft evening light, everything shifts toward blue and deep green. Clusters of grapes hang like night-coloured jewels. Broad leaves catch the last rays of the sun and turn them into sheets of pale gold. The soundscape is simple. Water dripping, leaves whispering, a single bird calling from the highest terrace. Somewhere below, the city hums, but it feels far away, softened by height and foliage, as though the gardens are a small island floating above the world. The Greeks believed the gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. To them, the idea of a man-made mountain covered in living things felt miraculous, a sign of kingship so absolute it could sculpt nature into new forms. But what makes the story linger through centuries, across dusty libraries, across scholars' debates, across every textbook, isn't just engineering or royalty. It's the feeling, the image, the way the gardens seem to embody a human longing so old we barely notice it anymore, the wish to bring life where life struggles, the desire to craft beauty out of heat and hardship, Some modern scholars believe the gardens were never in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, built not by Nebuchadnezzar II, but by the Assyrian king Sennacherib in the 7th century BCE. They point to inscriptions boasting of a monumental garden watered by a complex system of aqueducts and canals, a place where exotic plants grew in stunning abundance. They note that later Greek writers often confused Babylon and Nineveh, mixing stories the way river currents mix silt. But even if the true location was different, if the terraces grew hundreds of kilometers to the north, the dream remains the same. Lushness where there should be dryness, shade where the sun burns longest, green steps rising like an invitation to breathe deeper. So let us return to our imagined Babylon. You climb higher now, up the stone stairways built between the terraces. Each step takes you further from the noise of the city and closer to a quiet that feels almost sacred. The queen, if she ever walked here, would have seen the whole horizon spread out before her, the Euphrates bending like a bronze ribbon, the far fields shimmering under the late sun, caravans moving like tiny beads toward distant trade routes. You reach the top terrace. The light is fading, and the heat of the day becomes a warm cloak around your shoulders. Up here, the air tastes different, like damp soil cooling after sunset, like crushed mint, like promises spoken softly beneath breath. A lone cypress rises beside you, tall and straight as a prayer. It shouldn't survive in this climate, and yet it does, in this impossible place where the desert was persuaded, for a time, to bloom. And now, for a moment, imagine the space at night. The city below glows with torchlight. The ziggurat of Marduk rises like a stepped shadow against the stars. And the gardens, our gardens, become almost invisible, dissolved into darkness except where pale flowers reflect the moon. Cool air drifts between the leaves. The river continues its ancient journey. The machines keep lifting water. The foliage sighs softly as the night creatures wake. It is in moments like this that the gardens feel most real. Not as a tourist site, not as a debated ruin, but as a feeling humanity keeps returning to again and again. A desire to cradle life, to soften a harsh landscape, to say, here, in this place, grow. Of all the 7 wonders, the hanging gardens are the only one that may never have existed in the form we imagine. And yet they remain, perhaps for that very reason, the most dreamlike. They exist just enough to spark belief, but not enough to satisfy it. They hover between the lines of history, like a perfume that lingers after its source disappears. When ancient travellers spoke of Babylon, they spoke of its walls, its palaces, its gates, but the gardens were the detail they saved for last, the soft flourish at the end of a story. Something beautiful rising where it had no right to rise, something tender surviving in the furnace heat of an empire. As you stand on the upper terrace now, feeling the last warmth of the sun leave the stones, you realize why the legend endured. It was never simply about architecture or irrigation or the pride of kings. It was about the way the human mind longs for coolness, for shade, for the sound of water in a dry land. It was about the way people remember hope not as a fact, but as a feeling, something we choose to keep alive even when the evidence fades. So whether the gardens rose in Babylon or Nineveh, whether they were built by Nebuchadnezzar II or Sennacherib, or whether they lived only in the imaginations of storytellers, the truth is that they exist still, right here, in this quiet moment of wondering. A green mountain in the desert, a soft breath in the heat, a promise that even in the driest air, life can find a way to climb. Breathe slowly. The night gathers around the terraces, the leaves settle, the water flows, and the gardens, real or imagined, hang gently in your mind as we drift on. Settle a little deeper now, letting your breath smooth itself into long, unhurried waves. Because the next part of our quiet journey brings us to a place where devotion once pooled like still water, where light fell upon gold and ivory, shaped into a god's calm face. Tonight, we enter the hushed inner chamber of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and we stand before one of the most revered creations of the ancient world, the statue of Zeus, crafted by the famed sculptor Phidias around 435 BCE. Let the evening soften around you as we step gently into this sacred space. Imagine first the grounds of Olympia, a sanctuary older than memory, settled in the lush valley where the Alpheus River curls like a silver thread across the land. In the centuries before roads and crowds and written histories, this place was already holy, an olive-shadowed grove dedicated to a god whose presence was felt in thunder and in silence alike. By the 5th century BCE, the Greeks had raised here not only the earliest athletic games, but a constellation of temples, altars, treasuries, stoas, fountains, structures meant to honour Zeus in form as well as spirit, but none carried the weight of awe like the great temple designed by Libon of Elis, a long, stately rectangle of limestone columns that lifted their fluted shafts toward the open sky. And deep inside, where shadows pooled like ink and footsteps softened against the floor, stood the masterpiece that drew pilgrims from across the ancient world. Before we go in, pause just outside the great doorway. The air is warm. Cypress trees stand like quiet guardians. You hear distant voices, athletes training, priests murmuring, travellers arriving from distant islands. But ahead of you, the temple's threshold feels like the boundary between two worlds, the outer shifting with wind and seasons, and the inner steady as stone, a place where stillness becomes something almost sacred. Now we step inside. The change in light envelops you immediately. The world narrows to the cool dimness of a forest at dusk. Your eyes adjust slowly, gently, as though the room is teaching you how to see. You make out the tall columns rising in rows, their surfaces catching faint glimmers of afternoon sun filtered through the doorway behind you. And then, as your vision steadies, you sense the presence of something immense ahead, something quiet but overwhelming, like a mountain that breathes. The statue of Zeus is seated. That is the first impression, a god at rest, but not in repose. He sits upon a massive throne adorned with ebony and gold, carved with mythical creatures, griffins, sphinxes, winged victory figures, as though the stories of the world have gathered to support him. The throne alone could be its own wonder, a riot of delicate craftsmanship rising from the floor like a carved forest of myth. But then your eyes rise to the figure himself, and the breath in your chest slows to match the rhythm of the room. Phidias shaped Zeus from ivory and gold, using a technique called chryselephantine, thin plates of gleaming material fixed over a wooden core, polished so beautifully that the statue seemed almost to glow from within. In the subdued light of the temple's cellar, the ivory face appears soft and alive, with features arranged not in anger or thunderous power, but in a serene dignity. Zeus's expression is calm, as though ruling the heavens requires no strain at all. The god of thunder sits in unshakable peace. His height is legendary. Ancient writers like Pausanias describe the statue rising over 40 feet so tall that if Zeus were to stand, they said, his head would break through the roof. And yet the feeling you get atop this quiet moment is not intimidation, it is gentleness, reverence, a sense that the sculptor wished not to frighten those who entered, but to soothe them. Look to his right hand. It holds a small figure of Nike, the winged goddess of victory, delicately balanced upon Zeus's open palm. She, too, is crafted of gold and ivory, her wings sweeping backward as though stirred by some silent breath. And in his left hand, Zeus holds a sceptre crowned by an eagle, his sacred emblem, its form carved with such careful attention that even in shadow you imagine the curve of its beak, the soft edge of its feathers. The room feels alive, though you hear nothing moving. Light settles over the gold in warm pools, creating the illusion that Zeus's body shifts just slightly as the day passes, as though his divine stillness contains the smallest pulse of breath. When the priests tended the lamps in the evenings, the flames would reflect off the gold and cast trembling patterns across the ivory cheeks, making some ancient visitors swear they saw the god blink. Imagine the pilgrims. They came from Sparta, Corinth, Athens, Syracuse. They came by sea, by dusty roads, by riverboat. Some travelled weeks or months for the chance to stand where you stand now. And when they entered this room, their steps slowed, their gazes lifted, their voices lowered. Many wept. Not from fear, but from awe, the same awe that settles like warm dusk around you now. And behind this immense creation was one man, Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the classical world. He had already completed his monumental statue of Athena Parthenos in Athens, but the Zeus at Olympia was his masterwork, the one that later generations would call a wonder not for its size, but for its soul. Phidias worked in a dedicated workshop beside the temple, a place archaeologists identified centuries later by tools, moulds, and a small cup with the inscription, "I belong to Phidias." One imagines him in the soft morning light, studying ivory, ready to be shaped, smoothing gold leaf with steady fingers, considering how to make a god both human and divine. The workmanship is so delicate that even today scholars marvel at how thin the ivory plates must have been, how carefully the wooden framework must have been designed to bear the statue's immense weight. As we stand here, let the scene quiet itself further. The faint scent of olive oil lamps lingers in the air. Dust motes drift like tiny stars across the golden surfaces. Outside, the world of training athletes and cheering crowds continues. But inside this sacred chamber, time slows to a gentle, ancient heartbeat. You could sit here for hours. Visitors once did. They would arrive carrying small offerings, garlands, figs, soft breads, miniature clay animals, and set them gently at the base of the statue. Priests tended to the space, ensuring the lamps burned and the ivory stayed polished, rubbing the surfaces with warm oil to preserve their sheen. In this room, craft and faith were the same gesture, the same breath. Over the centuries, the temple saw earthquakes, repairs, festivals, shadows, laughter, and grief. Yet the statue remained steady, serene in its massive calm. Even the Roman Emperor Caligula attempted to move it to Rome, planning to replace Zeus's head with his own. The attempt failed, the machinery broke, and the workers whispered that the god had shaken the structure in warning. Eventually, though, time grew heavier. When the Roman Emperor Theodosius I banned pagan worship in 391 CE, the temple fell silent. The statue was reportedly moved to Constantinople, where it may have remained until a fire in the 5th century CE consumed it. After that, the trail drifts into silence, as so many ancient trails do. But here, in this moment, the statue remains, whole, illuminated, waiting. Notice now the quiet curve of Zeus's beard, the gentle incline of his head, the soft arrangement of folds in his draped robe. Nothing is rushed, nothing is harsh. Phidias carved the idea of patience into the god's very posture. The statue's calm majesty was part of its message. True power does not need to raise its voice. Even now, centuries later, the effect remains. You feel it in your shoulders, loosening. You feel it in your breath, deepening. You feel it in the atmosphere around you, as though the air itself has learned to sit still in the presence of something greater than time. Let the moment hold you. The temple is dim, the gold is warm, the ivory glows softly like moonlit skin. The god is still seated, unmoving, eternal in his quiet. And as the ancient world once did, we leave him now with the steady reverence of slow steps, carrying with us the lingering calm of his presence. As you walk back into the light of the evening, the soft Greek dusk spreading across Olympia, you still feel the hush of the sanctuary around you, as though the god's majesty rests gently in your memory, ready to rise again whenever you close your eyes. Settle again into that slow rhythm, the one your breath discovers when a story moves gently forward. Because now our journey drifts westward, toward the coast of Asia Minor, to a place where the sea air once carried the scent of salt, warm earth, and fresh-cut marble. The ancient city of Ephesus rests here, along the edge of what is now modern-day Turkey, and centuries ago it held one of the largest and most astonishing sanctuaries ever built. The Temple of Artemis, a place that rose more than once, each time brighter and grander, earning its place among the seven wonders. Imagine the land first. The sun is low, casting a soft gold across the open plain. Birds sweep in wide arcs overhead, and ahead of you, the last shadows of evening stretch in long ribbons over the old foundations. Walk slowly across the quiet field, and picture this space not as a ruined site, but as it once was. The entrance to a sanctuary where travellers arrive from every corner of the ancient world to honour Artemis, the goddess of the wild, of childbirth, of protection, and of the in-between places where civilization meets the quiet mystery of nature. We begin long before the marble colonnades, though before the ornate sculptures, before the bustling markets, before even the earliest stone foundations. This area, archaeologists say, was sacred for far longer than the Greek city existed. A small shrine stood here around 800 BCE, built of simple materials, nothing like the wonder that would one day take its place. The ground beneath your feet is layered with centuries of reverence. But the sanctuary grew, it widened, and in 560 BCE, the Lydian king Crassus, whose name still echoes whenever people talk about great wealth, funded the first truly monumental temple. His builders raised towering columns, carved friezes, and broad marble steps that caught the sunrise with a quiet, steady glow. Pillars stood in long, elegant rows, 127 of them. Ancient sources say each nearly 60 feet tall. When travellers approached from the road, the temple seemed to float above the plain, pale and luminous, like a marble mirage. Picture yourself standing now at the foot of those steps. The stone beneath you is faintly warm from the day. The night is sliding in gently, and torches line the approach. The ivory-coloured columns rise into the gathering darkness like the trunks of enormous, silent trees. And inside, soft lamplight illuminates the statue of Artemis, deliberately unlike the hunting goddess seen in later Greek art. Here she is adorned with symbolic shapes, animals, and intricate decorations that reflected the local traditions of the region. Long robes cascade down her form, carved with lions, bulls, and mythic creatures. To ancient eyes, she embodied not just a goddess, but the deep, fertile layers of the earth itself. Step inside. The air cools. The ceiling arches high above, vanishing into shadow. A steady quiet fills the vast chamber. as though the very walls have learned to listen. Even at the height of its crowds, this place held an unusual calm, a calm born from scale, reverence, and the sense that life moved differently under Artemis's watchful gaze. People came seeking protection, mothers, traders, sailors about to leave for long voyages, farmers hoping for healthy harvests. Deposits of jewelry, coins, pottery, and carved figurines were placed here as offerings. Some were finely crafted, others were simple tokens made by ordinary hands. All of them left in hopes of a blessing. And yet, for all this beauty and devotion, the temple's story is shaped by both creation and loss. The first great catastrophe came in 356 BCE, on a night that would later echo through history for its strangeness. A man named Herostratus set fire to the temple in an act of destructive vanity, an attempt to immortalize his own name. The blaze lit the sky, swallowing wood supports and cracking marble under its heat. Historians still argue whether he acted alone or if deeper political tensions played a role, but the legend endured. The Ephesians, in rage, banned the mention of his name, a ban that, ironically, ensured his motives would be remembered. Yet from this tragedy came the opportunity for renewal. The people of Ephesus rebuilt not minimally, not cautiously, but boldly. They envisioned a structure even grander than before. They widened the platform. They raised even taller columns. They filled the sanctuary with sculptural work from the best artists of the age. By the time it was completed in the 4th century BCE, the second Temple of Artemis had become the largest temple in the Greek world, even larger than the Parthenon. Imagine that second version now as we walk through the reconstructed memory of it. The steps stretch wide, inviting thousands to enter. The columns align in double rows, sweeping forward in perfect symmetry, so numerous and so tall that even modern visitors struggle to imagine their full scale. Torches along the perimeter glow like suspended embers. Their light flickers against the polished marble, giving the walls a gentle radiance in the dark. Inside, artisans had filled every surface with detail. Reliefs carved into drum sections of the columns displayed scenes of gods, heroes, and creatures from myth. In some places, the carvings were shallow and delicate. In others, they were deep and dramatic, shadows settling into the grooves as though the images breathed. And there were stories here, too quirky, fringe, and strange ones. One tale claims that bees guided the builders to the perfect site for the second reconstruction, circling above the land as if pointing out sacred ground. Another preserved story suggests that the marshy earth beneath the temple prevented earthquakes from destroying it, allowing the structure to sway gently like a ship on water. Historians still argue whether this was intentional engineering or simply an interesting coincidence that ancient writers embellished. Picture now a festival night. Lanterns swing gently from bronze hooks. Musicians play low, rhythmic patterns on flutes and lyres. Hundreds of visitors move through the colonnades, carrying small votive offerings, some wrapped in cloth, others in baskets woven from reeds. The soft murmur of prayer drifts through the air, mingling with the quiet clatter of sandals on marble. In this moment, the temple is more than stone. It's a living landscape, glowing and breathing with the people who came to celebrate Artemis's day. But time, as always, shifts. The Romans arrived. The city changed. Floods shifted the riverbed. Trade routes moved. The harbour silted up. And although the temple remained a place of wonder for centuries, its fortunes declined. In 262 CE, a Gothic invasion damaged the structure severely. Repairs were attempted, but when Christian rule expanded and pagan worship was restricted, the sanctuary fell into neglect. Stone was repurposed, Columns were transported to Constantinople. Fragments of sculptures ended up in distant buildings. The once marble sanctuary slowly dissolved into the landscape. Today, only a single reconstructed column rises from the field, quiet, solitary, its surface reflecting the sky. And yet, if you stand there long enough and let your imagination breathe a little, the memory of the old wonder flickers at the edges of the mind. You may picture the long line of columns extending into the dark. You may imagine the glow of torchlight on polished stone. You may recall the steady footsteps of pilgrims arriving with quiet hopes in their hearts. The temple may have fallen more than once, but what remains in stories and in the calm of this moment is the sense of a sanctuary built not only of marble, but of devotion layered through generations. Let the memory settle. Let the colonnades fade gently back into twilight, and feel yourself stepping away from Ephesus, carrying with you the soft shimmer of marble under moonlight and the distant echo of festival music that once filled this sacred place. We leave the Temple of Artemis quietly now, walking back into the deepening night, ready to continue our path through the remaining wonders. Take a slow breath in, letting the last traces of Ephesus settle gently behind you. Tonight, our path turns southward along the old Aegean coastline, toward a city that once glittered with white stone walls, bustling harbours, and terraced houses rising like steps above a shining bay. This is Halicarnassus, the capital of ancient Caria, and centuries ago it held a structure unlike anything the world had seen before. The Mausoleum, the monumental tomb of Mausolus, a ruler whose very name would become a word for grand tombs everywhere. We arrive here in the soft calm of evening. The sea rests quietly beyond the hills, its surface tinted blue-grey. The scent of warm earth mixes with the cool breath of the breeze drifting inland. Ahead of us, the city rests in layered terraces, each catching the last faint glow of daylight. And somewhere near the centre, once dominating the skyline, stood the tomb built by Artemisia II, Mausolus's wife and sister, who sought to honour him not just with devotion, but with a work so beautiful it would echo far beyond their lifetimes. Historians still argue whether Mausolus himself had begun the design before his death in 353 BCE, or whether Artemisia, heartbroken, envisioned it entirely on her own. But what we do know is that this was not an ordinary burial marker. It was a statement of memory, quiet, deliberate, and carved with an artistry that drew the finest sculptors in the Greek world. Imagine walking toward the hill where the mausoleum once stood. The city noise softens behind you. Olive trees line the path. And at the crest, rising above them, was the gleaming structure, a multi-tiered monument blending Greek, Lycian, and Egyptian influences into one harmonious whole. Ancient writers described it in detail, and though time has taken much from us, our minds can rebuild it piece by piece. Picture the broad rectangular base, made of marble, forming a platform that lifted the building well above the city. Upon it, a long row of Ionic columns encircled the inner chamber, giving the structure both grace and lightness despite its enormous size. The columns supported a pyramid-shaped roof, steep and elegant, and at the summit, silhouetted against the sky, stood a marble quadriga, a 4-horse chariot driven by statues of Mausolus and Artemisia. The height of the entire structure may have reached nearly 150 feet, tall enough to pull the eye upward from anywhere in the city and from ships entering the harbour. Travellers arriving by sea would spot it shining in the sunlight, a marble beacon that signalled both the wealth of Caria and the deep devotion of a queen. Step a little closer. Imagine the crisp white surface of the marble glowing softly in the morning light. Picture the shadows cast by the long procession of columns. And listen, perhaps, to the faint tapping of chisels as artisans continued sculpting even after the main construction was complete. Artemisia had summoned the finest sculptors of her age, Scopas, Bryaxis, Leochares, and Timotheus, each responsible for a different side of the frieze that wrapped the mausoleum like an elaborate stone ribbon. Their collaboration remains one of history's great artistic gatherings, something like an ancient dream team, though they likely stood around arguing about tools and technique the way artists always have. Even the ancient world wasn't free from mildly dramatic creative disagreements. As you imagine walking around the mausoleum, pause to look at the friezes. Here, carved in deep relief, are scenes of centaurs clashing with Lapith warriors, muscles straining, limbs twisting, faces expressing both fury and determination. On another side, Amazon warriors confront Greek soldiers in swirling, dynamic combat. Though the scenes are full of motion, the overall effect is strangely peaceful in the fading light. The details soften, and the movement becomes a graceful rhythm rather than a violent clash. This contrast energy, held in quietness, defines much of the mausoleum's beauty. Even towering statues carved around the perimeter seemed calm despite their size. Some depicted Mausolus himself, wearing long robes, his posture dignified and steady. Others portrayed gods and mythic creatures, lions, horses, griffins. There is even a quirky tradition claiming that one sculptor secretly added the face of a local fisherman into one of the friezes as a joke, though historians still argue whether this is a genuine ancient anecdote or a much later embellishment. Step closer still toward the center chamber, the heart of the mausoleum. Here lay the tomb of Mausolus, placed within the structure's most protected space. Offerings would have sat nearby: pottery, small figurines, objects carved from bone or polished stone. Artemisia, devoted in her grief, is said to have performed elaborate funerary rites. One story, strange and fringe but famous, claims she mixed some of Mausolus's ashes into her drink so that he would become part of her, inseparable from her own body. Most scholars doubt this ever happened, but the tale persists because it captures something emotional about her dedication. Artemisia herself died only 2 years after Mausolus, and so the mausoleum, though built in his name, became a monument to them both. Their memory rested side by side, wrapped in crisp marble and the touch of countless sculptors who poured their skill into every surface. Walk once more around its perimeter. Listen to the quiet evening in Halicarnassus donkeys, braying in the lower streets, waves breaking softly on the harbour walls, the rustle of fig leaves in the hilltop breeze. The mausoleum, in this moment, stands not only as a tomb, but as a point of pride for a city that blended Greek and local Carian culture into something unique. As centuries passed, Halicarnassus changed hands many times: Persians, Greeks, Romans, all leaving their mark. Yet the mausoleum survived earthquakes that toppled other structures. Its engineering was astonishingly resilient. Some scholars suggest its multi-tiered design helped distribute weight more evenly than simpler temples. Still, even the strongest monuments face the steady patience of time. A series of earthquakes in the 12th through 15th centuries CE finally caused the roof and columns to collapse. The chambers broke open, and stones scattered across the hillside. By the time the Knights of Street, John arrived in the 15th century, they found the mausoleum in ruins and repurposed many of its stones to fortify Bodrum Castle nearby. If you visit the castle today, you're likely walking past fragments chipped directly from a wonder. But even broken, the mausoleum left a quiet legacy. Over the centuries, archaeologists uncovered pieces of the friezes, shattered statues, column drums, and fragments of the quadriga. Each discovery helped rebuild the image of the monument in the world's collective memory. Standing among these fragments now, one feels a strange calm, the awareness that beauty can dissolve but not disappear. And in our quiet moment here, let the structure rise again in your mind. Picture the marble steps ascending toward the colonnade. Picture the high, square cellar at its centre. Picture the pyramid roof climbing into the sky like a stone mountain. Picture the chariot crowning it all, Mausoleum and Artemisia portrayed not as rulers caught in the rush of life, but as figures lifted into timeless stillness. One mainstream fact historians often emphasize is how deeply this structure influenced later architecture, not just tombs, but entire traditions of commemorative buildings. From Roman emperor tombs to Renaissance memorials to modern mausoleums, the very idea of building an elegant resting place for the dead traces its lineage back to this wonder in Halicarnassus. And as a fringe curiosity, there's a preserved ancient comment claiming that if anyone walked around the mausoleum counterclockwise 7 times, they'd be blessed with long memory. Whether this was a sincere belief or an early tourist joke is hard to tell. Historians still argue whether rituals like this were ever practiced or simply described by later writers with a taste for the unusual. But in the quiet of tonight's journey, these details fold gently into one another. You feel the stone beneath your feet, even if only imagined. You feel the breeze moving through the colonnade. You feel the steady presence of a monument built not for spectacle, but for remembrance. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was, above all, an act of love carved into stone. Now, let that memory settle like dust over marble. Step back from the hill. The Aegean night is calm. The lights of ancient Halicarnassus glow faintly below. And ahead of us, the road continues toward the next wonder, another story waiting to unfold. They reach the island of Rhodes in the calmest way, almost as if drifting on a quiet current at dusk, when the sea evens out into a smooth, dark sheet and the harbour lights begin their steady glow. The island has always had that gentle mix of wind and stone, a place where sailors once paused, rested, and repaired their ships before moving on to other corners of the Mediterranean. And somewhere in that slow rhythm of arrivals and departures, a colossal bronze figure once rose above the entrance to the harbour, high enough to make visitors catch their breath. Tonight, the story unfolds softly, as if the sea itself is whispering it. Rhodes had faced a long and difficult siege in the early 3rd century BCE. Neighbouring forces, led by Demetrius, who carried the rather theatrical title the Besieger, tried to take the island with giant siege engines and towers that rolled awkwardly across the earth. Yet the people of Rhodes held firm. They had their alliances, their stubborn pride, and perhaps a bit of luck as well. When the siege finally ended in failure, the Rhodians were left with a remarkable problem, an enormous war machine abandoned just outside their city. Instead of letting it rust quietly, they made the surprisingly practical decision to sell it as scrap metal. With the profits, they decided to commission a monument to their resilience. It was a calm sort of triumph, not the noisy celebration of victory, but a steady, determined announcement that they were still standing. And in that mood, the idea of the Colossus was born. The sculptor chosen for the task was Ceres of Lindos, a Rhodian artisan trained in bronze work under the famed Lysippos. Ceres approached the commission with careful confidence, knowing the statue would not only represent the sun god Helios, protector of the island, but would also signal Rhodes's place in the world. The ancient sources say the statue rose nearly 100 feet tall, though historians still argue whether that number was exaggerated by later writers who loved a good dramatic flourish. Even so, Whatever its exact height, it was undeniably massive, large enough that ancient travellers described it with equal parts awe and confusion. To build it, Chares and his team worked from the ground up, using a framework of iron and stone to anchor the interior. Bronze plates were hammered into shape and then fixed layer by layer, creating a skin that caught the Mediterranean light in a warm, steady glow. Because of its size, the statue could not be cast in a single piece. It had to be assembled gradually, with temporary earth ramps built around it, so workers could reach higher sections safely. One fringe story, told much later, claims that donkeys carried the earth away once the statue was finished, revealing the enormous figure as if emerging from a slow-motion sunrise. It's probably not literally true, but it stays in the retellings because people enjoy imagining something colossal gradually unveiled. And then there's the famous debate, the one everyone knows. Did the statue straddle the harbour entrance? Some illustrations show ships sailing between its legs, like a scene straight out of an ancient adventure tale. But most scholars agree it likely stood solidly on one side of the harbour, not both. The logistics alone would have turned the project into a nightmare. Yet the image persists, because it's dramatic and fun, and people tend to remember the most cinematic version of a story. Even in ancient times, travellers probably embellished the details when telling friends what they saw. One might imagine someone saying, well, maybe it didn't exactly stand over the harbour, but it felt like it did. For a while, the Colossus stood proudly, an emblem of sunlight, victory, and a kind of quiet determination. Ships approaching the island would see the bronze form rising above them, Helios, holding his torch or crown depending on the artistic reconstruction, welcoming traders, wanderers, and diplomats. Rhodes was a bustling hub in those days, and the statue became part of its identity. Some travellers even claimed the figure glowed at dawn, catching the first light in a way that made it seem alive. But bronze, for all its strength, cannot persuade the earth to stay still. About 56 years after the statue's completion, an earthquake shook Rhodes. Temples cracked, walls shifted, and the Colossus, despite its internal scaffolding, could not hold its balance. The massive figure collapsed, falling in pieces among the harbour stones. It must have been a shocking sight. The sun god lying broken on the ground, the giant limbs twisted and heavy, the carefully hammered plates bent after their long watch above the sea. The people of Rhodes were devastated. For them, the statue was more than decoration. It was a symbol of their endurance. When they consulted an oracle about whether they should rebuild, the answer was discouraging. The guidance suggested leaving the fallen god as he was, so they accepted it, choosing to respect what they believed was divine instruction. And so the Colossus rested where it fell. Even so, the story didn't end there. For centuries afterward, travellers continued coming to Rhodes not to see the standing giant, but to marvel at the remains. Ancient writers say some visitors tried to wrap their arms around the statue's thumb and couldn't reach all the way around. Others talked about the hollow interior and how thick each bronze plate truly was. There's even a quirky detail, an account that curious tourists would climb onto the collapsed torso just to say they had stood on the shoulder of a god. It paints a strangely human picture, people treating the fallen Colossus almost like a playground while still feeling awe at its scale. The statue remained on the ground for nearly 900 years. Eventually, in the 7th century CE, invaders dismantled what was left and reportedly sold the bronze to merchants who carried it away on caravans. Whether that story is fully accurate, embellished, or a mix of both is difficult to know. Historians still argue whether the amount of bronze claimed in the tale is physically plausible. Yet the idea of the Colossus being carried off on the backs of camels has such a dramatic flair that it stayed in the historical imagination. When people think of the Seven Wonders today, the Colossus often stands out because of how little of it survives. Unlike the Great Pyramid, which still rises from the desert, or the ruins of the Temple of Artemis, which can be visited quietly in Ephesus, the Colossus exists almost entirely in memory and speculation. But maybe that's part of its calm appeal. It reminds listeners that sometimes the most enduring things are those held together by stories rather than stone or bronze. And as they imagine Rhodes today, its calm harbour, its quiet walkways, the gentle clatter of boats settling into their moorings, there's still that sense that something once towered there. Even if no one can say with certainty how it looked or exactly where it stood, the island carries the echo of it, a shadow shaped like pride, resilience, and a bronze figure watching the sea. They arrive at Alexandria with the gentle sense of stepping into a coastal dream, a place shaped by calm harbours, soft currents, and the faint pull of old stories resting just beneath the waves. The city has always carried a unique atmosphere, blending Greek foundations with Egyptian light, and tonight that mixture settles into a comforting hush. Out on the island of Pharos, past the curve of the shoreline, something once rose tall enough to guide ships from miles away. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, a beacon that didn't just shine across the water but shaped how people imagined navigation for centuries. To picture it, they begin slowly, as if taking a quiet stroll down the ancient causeway. This long ribbon of stone called the Heptastidion once linked Alexandria to the island. Waves would break gently against the sides, and travellers could walk across while feeling the sea close on both sides. At the end of that path, surrounded by the rhythm of waves and murmuring winds, stood the lighthouse. Ancient sources estimate its height at somewhere around 100 metres, though historians still argue whether those measurements were exaggerated by enthusiastic writers. Even so, a tower of that scale would have been astonishing in its time, rising higher than nearly anything else humans had constructed. The lighthouse was commissioned by Ptolemy I and completed under his son Ptolemy II, sometime around the 3rd century BCE. It was designed by a man named Sostratus of Cnidus, whose name, according to one fringe story, was carved into the stone beneath a layer of plaster, so he could be remembered even if official inscriptions favoured the ruling family. Whether that tale is literal truth or just a clever anecdote passed down through admiring storytellers, it adds a human touch to the enormous structure. A lone architect hoping that, centuries later, someone might peel back the surface and whisper, "Ah, he wanted us to know." Built in 3 main sections, the lighthouse began with a wide, square base. This foundation offered stability against the force of storms and earthquakes, both of which Alexandria knew well. Above it rose an octagonal midsection, narrowing gradually but maintaining a strong, confident presence. Finally, at the top, a cylindrical tower held the shining heart of the entire structure. Ancient writers describe a statue crowning the very top, possibly representing Zeus or Poseidon, though the details vary. The combined silhouette would have been visible far into the horizon, catching sunlight by day and glowing with firelight by night. Every traveller approaching Alexandria would have looked toward it. In an age before bright electric signals, satellites, or digital maps, sailors relied on landmarks and sky patterns. A beacon that could guide a ship into safe waters was invaluable. They imagined those sailors spotting the faint shimmer of light after long nights at sea, knowing land was near and feeling the kind of relief that sinks straight to the bones. A place to anchor, rest, repair, and trade. A place to tell stories from other shores. Inside, the lighthouse had ramps long, spiralling paths wide enough for pack animals to climb. Workers would bring fuel for the fire, often wood or oil, keeping the beacon alive through the night. Some accounts even suggest the possibility of polished bronze mirrors positioned to project or intensify the light. Whether such mirrors were truly present is a matter historians still debate, since the technological precision required would have been demanding. Yet the idea remains popular because it captures a certain sense of ancient ingenuity, humanity always reaching a little further than expected. From a distance, the lighthouse probably appeared calm and steady, but life around it must have been bustling. Ships of every size drifted in and out of the harbour. Merchants unloaded goods from Greece, Cyprus, and the Levant. Fishermen returned with nets still damp, and scholars drawn by the famous library and the city's reputation for knowledge would gather in shaded courtyards, copying texts and murmuring questions. Alexandria had that blend of intellectual curiosity and maritime rhythm that gave it a distinctive heartbeat. And through all of it, the lighthouse stood watch. There is a quirky detail tucked into old writings. Some visitors claimed that the tower's height allowed watchers at the top to see deep into the sea, almost as if the water turned translucent under their gaze. This idea likely sprang from a misunderstanding of how light refracts at great distances, but it has persisted because it feels like something someone standing that high might genuinely wonder about. It reminds listeners that even in the most advanced cities of the ancient world, people were always trying to understand nature in the ways available to them. The structure stood for many centuries, surviving storms, winds, and a changing political landscape, but its greatest challenge came from the earth itself. Northern Egypt sits on a zone vulnerable to seismic activity, and over time, several significant earthquakes shook Alexandria. The lighthouse didn't collapse all at once. Instead, it endured damage bit by bit, like a giant aging slowly but visibly. Reports from medieval Arab travellers describe cracked foundations, fallen stones, and sections that leaned dangerously. They observed its decline with a certain sadness, because even in ruin, the lighthouse inspired admiration. Eventually, the damage became too much. By the 14th century, large portions of the structure had fallen into the sea. The once bright tower that guided countless sailors was reduced to remnants scattered beneath the waves. Later, some of the stones were repurposed to build defensive structures along the coast, a practical choice that also carried a faint echo of the lighthouse's protective purpose. Even in fragments, it continued to guard Alexandria in a different form. Centuries passed, the waters around Pharos changed, new buildings rose, and the memory of the lighthouse settled into legend. But the story didn't end with its disappearance. In the late 20th century, divers exploring the harbour made an unexpected discovery. Enormous blocks of granite, statues, and architectural pieces resting on the seabed. Many believe these submerged remains include parts of the lighthouse, offering a rare, quiet glimpse into its long-lost shape. Imagining divers swimming through that underwater landscape, tracing their gloved hands along ancient stones while fish weave through the shadows, adds a serene sense of rediscovery to the tale. It's as if the lighthouse never truly left, it simply shifted from sky to sea. The legacy of the Pharos is enormous. Its design influenced lighthouses across the ancient and medieval world, and even today, the word Pharos is used for lighthouse-related terms in several languages. Modern engineers still reflect on it with respect, not because every detail is known, but because it represented something bold and deeply practical, a structure meant to keep people safe, a tower built not for worship or burial, but for guidance. As they picture the lighthouse now, rising in their imagination above the calm Alexandrian water, they might sense its quiet strength. A light that once marked the edge of a city famous for knowledge. A signal for travellers who arrived weary and hopeful. A reminder that every coastline has stories waiting just beyond the horizon. And even though the lighthouse no longer stands, its presence lingers. In maps, in language, in the idea that a bright point in the distance can change everything for a traveller far from home. Sometimes a wonder survives not through stone but through the way people continue to remember it, generation after generation, with a kind of soft awe. As their journey draws to a close, the night feels quieter than before, as if the ancient world has finished speaking and now waits in a gentle hush. The seven wonders have carried them across deserts, along rivers, through harbours, and into temples that once glowed with torchlight. None of these places remain exactly as they were. Some have crumbled into fragments. Some have vanished beneath earthquakes or shifting coastlines. And yet, somehow, each one still lingers vividly in the imagination, steady as the rhythm of a calm breath. What makes these seven sites endure? Part of it is scale. Of course, the idea that long before electricity, cranes, or modern machinery, people dreamed big enough to shape mountains of stone, forests of marble, or towers bright enough to guide ships from miles away. But there is something softer woven into their stories too, something human. They were built out of hope, pride, devotion, and the quiet desire to be remembered. Even the fringed tales like donkeys uncovering the Colossus or mirrors casting light from the Pharos show how people throughout history loved filling the gaps with wonder. And maybe that is why the list still matters. It reminds listeners that ancient builders were not so different from anyone alive today. They faced limits, debated ideas, made mistakes, and tried again. Historians still argue whether every detail in the old descriptions is accurate, but the debates only highlight how deeply these structures impressed those who saw them. The uncertainty becomes part of the charm, inviting each new generation to imagine the missing pieces. When they think back on this journey, on the Great Pyramid rising from quiet sands, the possible terraces of Babylon's gardens drifting like greenery in dry air, the gold and ivory glow of Zeus at Olympia, the vast temple at Ephesus, the sculpted tomb in Halicarnassus, the bronze guardian of Rhodes, and the shining tower of Alexandria, they carry more than facts, they carry impressions. A sense of standing before something larger than themselves, shaped by hands now long at rest. Tonight, that lingering feeling settles around them like a soft blanket. The ancient world is far away, yet its echoes remain gentle and steady, threading through the dark with calm familiarity. And as they let those echoes fade into the background, the story settles too quiet, warm, and ready to rest.